article particularly written by Garton Warren in 2016 that showed kind of complementary underlying principles that both of these have, which I've really recommended reading. And some of the things that are really both phenomenology and perspective theory that gives us reason to use this as a tool to measure how our clients change in therapy. Both have real-world individual focus. We both see beings as being self-inventing, with choice in our lives, and we're faced with choices and the anxiety that brings us. And we're both relational beings, so how we see ourselves, how we see other people are always in relation with the context that we're in. In a kind of clinical comparison, Kelly states that we should kind of step back from our construing system sometimes and view it afresh. And in existentialism, also we are to, in therapy, bracket our assumptions so we can be with our clients. So never assuming that how we see our world is how they see our world. So a little bit of background about our service and how the repertory grids are used. We are based in GP surgeries, so the doctors will refer patients to us, and we have 2 surgeries in London. And this is kind of the timeline, the therapeutic timeline, and you can see there in red where the repertory grid sessions will be used. So it's about a week before and a week after therapy. We'll have this interview with all the clients we see. So far with the complete grids, we've got 40 clients, so 80 grids pre and post therapy. And actually we found our clients kind of anecdotally really like us using these grids. In the 3rd session after therapy, we give them a bit of feedback about how they see themselves and how they see other people and even their future self and how they would like to be. And we give them a bit of feedback of that so they can then think, okay, well, that's kind of how I thought of myself before. This is how I see myself after therapy. Is there any difference? So they can self-reflect on their assumptions and their predictions about themselves and people in their world. So our repertory grid technique is built in collaboration with David Winters. We use 10 elements that are pre-elicited by us. So there is kind of room for individualisation. So one of the elements is person I like and person I dislike, so they can choose in that way. And the constructs are elicited by them, so it's quite an individual, idiographic kind of repertory grid. And we use rating scales 1 to 7 to represent how people view the people that we talk about in the session. So, as we've kind of seen, there's loads of rich data that can come out of the repertory grid, and specifically we focused on measuring using structural measures to identify how people's constructs are used and how they make predictions about themselves and other people. Typically in kind of our NHS service and our mental health service, therapeutic change is measured by symptomatology, so well-being, depression scales and anxiety scales, and we see a lot of value in using a repertory grid that may be more individual way of measuring therapeutic change and moving away from symptomatology and more about the person and how they kind of form their beliefs and assumptions. Also, structural measures, the core structural measures or the core constructs of a construing system is said to be quite resistant to change. And why then is this a useful measure? Well, this could then be seen as a reliable measure of how to understand how clients change through therapy, and if there is a change after therapy of how they kind of use their constructs, then we would expect this change to last. So when we approach the idea of using structural measures to measure therapeutic change, we kind of went on a journey through how they're viewed and how they're used and the kind of measurements that there are. So we'd like to sort of take you through our journey of our research so far. So firstly, we looked at the idea of how to interpret these structural measures. So the area used the idea of cognitive complexity, in that we can measure how someone uses the construct systems by looking at how they use them differently, how they use their constructs differently, to kind of make sense of their world. So he suggests if we can identify differences by using our constructs, a lot of differences, then we can make more predictions about our world and more solutions, which he thinks is advantageous. Bannister suggested actually the kind of the more we focus on differences between people, maybe that suggests a kind of loose system in that we don't have consistency with our predictions. And so in looking at differences, using our constructs in a different way is good, but maybe the kind of extreme end of that scale isn't so good. And he also incorporated this idea of integration. So not only would it be good to focus on using our constructs differently to navigate in our world, but also using our constructs similarly, so identifying similarities between people and events. Zimmering actually Zimmering highlighted that this kind of model suggests that we are either use our constructs to identify differences, or we use our construct to identify similarities. And Zimmering puts forward the idea that actually we could maybe use both. If we use our constructs similarly, it doesn't necessarily mean we can't use them to identify differences about our world. So already we were kind of starting to see how there's confusion in what the kind of measures are best to understand how people use their constructs, and the kind of understanding of the terms of differentiation and integration. So we came across this paper by from Buteo 2000 that put forward a new way of looking at and measuring constructs, called the structural competence method. And what we really love about this is that instead of it being on a kind of one-dimensional way of how we use our constructs, he or they incorporate the idea that we can both look at similarities, and we can both have integration and differentiation in our construing system of how we see things. And so he says that they're kind of orthogonal to each other, but they're functionally independent ways of using constructs. And their paper kind of outlines a really good argument of why they needed to develop a new way of looking at structural methods, as Greta will kind of come on to in a bit, that there is some sort of confusion and concerns around them. So I won't go into the methods so much of how they mathematically kind of do this method, just for time, but we tried to use their algorithm that they use to replicate their results to kind of understand how it works, and we couldn't quite get the same results that they could, so we looked at the methodology a little bit more to understand how it works, and we're a bit concerned about maybe the validity of the methodology and the reliability of the results. Some of the things they do we're not quite sure about, so from that we love the idea, they're kind of the framework of this model. We really kind of believe in the fact that integration and differentiation should be seen as orthogonal measures. And they also not only look at how the constructs are used, but also how we use our elements. So they're kind of looking at these two kind of orthogonal measures to understand how we view people. So that's kind of burst our bubble a little bit to understand that maybe this method isn't as perfect as we want it to be. And so we didn't have a working experiment anymore. So then what happened next? What did we do next for our research? Explain.
So what we do next? What we've done was going back to basics, and so if the idea of SQM, we like the idea, we thought, right, so where this idea comes from the Landfield idea of viewing the construing system. Looking a bit back, we have, when the idea of integration came out, in a theoretical way, has been used in different ways, principally in two different ways. So we have integration that can be a measure of an hierarchically structure of between constructs. So a system that is integrated means that we have a cluster, say, of constructs that that integrates the lower levels of other constructs. So it's a hierarchy between these constructs. But another idea of integration that Landfield used is to see how a person can use elements and constructs in different way, in the sense of meaning of this thing. So the constructs and the elements seen in a different way. So in that case, we are able to make a discrimination within the construct. And so is this the idea of Landfield that we liked. So not just looking between constructs, but also within the construct. So it seems that sometimes, for instance, in this frame we can see that it's not just a line, we have four different cases. So if, for instance, we have a low differentiation, so all the we have a few clusters of constructs that works together, and so my word is seen just by a couple of meanings, right? But maybe my integration is high, so I can kind of discriminate within that construct between the elements, between a lot of people. So what we liked about this was this idea, and so we went through some of the measures that were used by Landfield, but also the widely used structural measures, to find a way of doing this theory, so to apply this theory. But we bumped in some problems. So I can't go deeply into all this because of time, but what I can say is, for instance, looking at the cognitive complexity, as Lawrence said, was the first idea of structural measures, right? And then, but in this case, for instance, theory assumes that the similarity between the constructs are exact matches of the rating. And for us, this is a bit risky, because we think that we risk to lose the tiny differences between the ratings, and that might be meaningful. For instance, intensity. The intensity is looks at the average correlation between the elements, between the constructs. Sorry. But as is the average, for us might be losing a bit of the heterogeneity. Heterogeneity. And so for us might be interesting to look, even if we have a correlation that is not really high, if we look at some constructs, some clusters of constructs, they may within them be really high correlated. This is the thing that actually the PVFF is doing. So it's more sensitive to this heterogeneity, because it's looking at clusters of constructs, how they work together within themselves, so with a high correlation, but between themselves might be not correlated. Anyway, every measure may us lose a bit of information. Sometimes also because we have a grid, which Lawrence explained is 9 by 10. So and in a scale of 7. So it's not really huge. It's used like this because it's used in a clinical context, and it takes already an hour to do it. But of course, we have not that many elements or constructs or rating points to be sure that all these measures are sharp enough, are making us able to look at the differences, at the tiny differences within and between. And so looking at the structure, so looking at how this construing system works. Where we are now. So we are still thinking that viewing the structural measures in a bidimensional way is the right way because it's more precise. We think that one dimension is not enough to look at the complexity in a complex way. So it is value to incorporate within construct analysis, which is between elements, because it gives us another vision, another viewing on that construct system, gives us more details, and can highlight a reality, I think, that we can't see if we look just one dimension. We are though still asking which structural measure we can use, because nothing seems to be mathematically and theoretically good enough. And how with the integration, because if we go backward for just a second, we can see that it's quite a few, it is quite confusing what is in differentiation, what is integration, sometimes it's both. And if we can see that differentiation sometimes is used just to one, so it's just clearly differentiation, we don't have this for the integration idea. And so now maybe you're asking why we are not giving up, considering all these problems.
Yeah, so I guess it's not all doom and gloom. We are still sort of in our process and in our journey of understanding how we can use these grids in a really amazing way, because we do see a lot of value in using repertory grids within our counselling service. And I think it can change the way we understand therapeutic change, like I said, kind of moving away a bit from just focusing on symptomatology. As I said also before, clients report, I've never thought of viewing myself in this way, or viewing, having this kind of snapshot idea of how the characteristics and the traits that I see myself having, I still see my future self having, so in about a year's time, how I would like to be. I've never compared my mum and my dad, or my partner and my father together in this way, so they kind of report to us that they find this session a really useful way of self-reflecting. So yes, let's think positively. We have some options, we just haven't got there yet.